Good morning. Thanks for joining us today for our Atlassian Enterprise JIRA Security and Permissions Management webinar. My name is Adam St. Pre, and I'm an Enterprise Solutions Engineer here at Atlassian. I'm responsible for providing our largest customers with best practices help and solutions for deploying Atlassian products. As part of that, I run our enterprise technical workshops, which we offer quarterly for enterprise customers. With me today is Chris Pepe from Praecipio, an Atlassian Enterprise expert. We'll be covering our main topic and focus for the day, JIRA security and permissions. For those of you that are new to our technical workshops, this is our fourth enterprise workshop. If you're here today, you're a customer of Atlassian Enterprise for JIRA. We will be recording this session, so it will be publicly available in about a week. But we wanted to make sure that our enterprise customers had a chance to ask questions during the presentation, and we will cover Q&A at the end. So today we want to cover three main topics. I'll give a quick update on our enterprise offering. Then Chris will present an overview of JIRA security and permissions management. And then finally, we'll leave time for Q&A. For any new customers out there, I'd like to just recap what Atlassian Enterprise is all about. Atlassian Enterprise offering is focused on providing the highest level of support possible with 24/7 phone and online support. Over the past year, we've ramped up quite a bit and dedicated enterprise support reps to serve our growing community. Atlassian Enterprise customers also get access to Atlassian University and our JIRA application admin course, Atlassian Enterprise is available for these three products: JIRA, Confluence, and Stash. Speaking of admin training, our next application admin course will be for JIRA. That'll be held September 30th, later this year, here in San Francisco, just before our summit event begins, which is scheduled for October 1st through the 3rd, again here in San Francisco. If you've never been to an Atlassian summit, I highly encourage you to attend. Our early bird registration is open currently, and I welcome you to go ahead and sign up at summit.atlassian.com. In addition, we have some additional webinars that are coming up. Atlassian Confluence Blueprints. Matt Hodges will be giving an overview of Confluence Blueprints on May 28th. Matt is our product marketing manager for Confluence. If you're new to Blueprints or interested in them, this is a good session to attend. They'll give you an overview on how to get started with Confluence, creating content in a quick, easy, and repeatable way. Additionally, we have a few other technical workshops that are in development on Confluence theme design, JIRA upgrades and integrations, and DVCS concepts with Stash and Git. Finally, I'd like to also invite you to join our Atlassian Enterprise community on LinkedIn. If you have not signed up already, please go ahead and do so. It's a primary place for enterprise customers to get information and stay up to date on what's happening across Atlassian Enterprise offering. It's a private group. It's open to enterprise customers, our experts, and Atlassians. It's a great place to discuss enterprise deployment specifically and raise questions you might have and share your experience with other enterprise customers. We also have more information on the Enterprise FAQ. Please don't hesitate to contact us if you have any questions, whether you're an existing customer or have questions on becoming an Atlassian Enterprise customer. If you'd like to upgrade, of course, you can do so at my.atlassian.com/purchase, or go to our Enterprise FAQ page to learn more. With that, I will turn things over to Chris to present on JIRA security.
I'm Chris Pepe from Praecipio Consulting. We are a process-oriented company. So we're Atlassian Enterprise experts. We consult around the entire Atlassian stack, and we help companies figure out what their processes are and how they fit into the Atlassian suite to better track their metrics, give them auditability, repeatability, and improve incident management, all of those sort of things. So today we're going to be talking about security and permissions management. This is a topic that I really like. We're going to look at first server level system administration security, and then we're going to move over into JIRA itself and look at what you can do within JIRA for permissions. I might have a note. Give me 1 second. Okay. So first off, whenever we talk about security, we want to think about balance. We're really balancing usability and security. In a lot of ways, the things that we'll be talking about today have become best practices because they already give you a lot of security without really sacrificing any usability. But if nothing else, there's a general conception that enhanced security means decreased usability. And I think passwords are a good example of that. Your IT policy is going to dictate some password policy. And it's going to say, passwords have to have this complexity, and we keep this long of a history, and whatever all the other rules are. So then you're starting to balance your physical security of users are not able to remember their passwords, so they write them down, with your digital security of we don't want brute force, attacks and people guessing passwords. So finding the balance between the level of security that you want to have and usability for your users is one of the things you need to think about when you're architecting the security policy around how you're setting up this suite. One of the main considerations you might be making is whether or not your service is public facing. So all of Atlassian's, JIRA and Confluence and everything instances are all public facing. You can get to them from the internet. In a lot of cases, you can sign up. So as a completely random person on the internet, you can sign up for an account. So their security concerns are going to be very different than a company that's running JIRA for 50 users on the innermost protected layer of their corporate network. Even within your internal networks, there's still a lot of security concerns, or at least security considerations that you should make. But at the very least, you don't have necessarily as many unknown and potentially malicious users that are going to be targeting your system. And then finally, encryption is what we're going to talk about. That one's kind of a no-brainer. It's maybe a little bit of overhead to set up initially, but computers are really fast these days. The overhead of actually encrypting and decrypting packets going back and forth between the server and the client is really not that big of a deal, and it buys you tons and tons of protection. So encryption is a really good thing to do. So before we actually get to install JIRA, we have to actually stage our server and secure it. So kind of some best practices around that is first off using named users. So everybody that has a shell account on this server is actually a named user. Ideally, they're not logging in as root or suing to root. They're using sudo when they need to run commands that require escalated privileges. And this just ensures that all of the logging that's happening on the server is going to be able to be traced back to an individual user. Most likely the case is going to be that an admin logs in, updates a package or changes a file or does something, and that's what breaks something. But you also have the fringe case of a malicious attacker somehow gaining access to a user's account and using that to do whatever they're going to do. Either way, you want to be able to get back to a root cause and figure out what actually happened, what went wrong, what caused this instability or this incident, and what can we do in the future to prevent that from happening again. Along with named users, strong passwords or using SSH keys is a technique to give you a reasonable level of confidence that the named user that's being named in your logs is actually the person who's doing those things. So again, you have your own password policies, but some number of characters, uppercase, lowercase, numbers, special characters, not based on dictionary words. There's whole theories written around creating strong passwords, but ensuring that you have strong passwords or even better SSH keys. So that someone actually has to physically possess the correct key to get into the server are good ways of ensuring that the named user is who they say they are. And then not running your services as root is one of the other main things that you're going to want to consider. That's something that the JIRA installer actually does for you. It creates a underprivileged user and configures JIRA to run as that underprivileged user. So with some of the Atlassian tools, you have to set them up yourself, so you want to make sure you're not running them as root. And then starting to extend off of that, now you have your server set up. You want to start thinking about how are you going to harden that server. There are really only a couple ports that need to be open. JIRA is, of course, a web application. JIRA is a Java application that runs in Tomcat, and by default, it's going to run on port 8080. There's no reason for that to be exposed if you are using Apache or something like that as a proxy. If you're going to serve directly at a Tomcat, maybe you change the port to port 80 so that users are a little more used to the URL format. But if you're using some sort of a proxy, then you want to make sure you shut down the JIRA port and any other daemons that are running on the server that don't need to be exposed. You want to shut all of those ports down so that only things that actually need to explicitly be exposed are actually exposed. So port 80, port 443, those are the two that you're going to need to actually run JIRA as a web application, and port 80 is really just a convenience for users. That's HTTP. So most likely your user is going to put in jira.mycompany.com and expect JIRA to work. But if you're running on SSL, then it needs to be HTTPS, so by leaving port 80 open and redirecting to 443, you're giving users a little convenience and helping them get over to the SSL encrypted website. That way all of your traffic going back and forth can't be intercepted. Where we have the attacker shown in this diagram is actually where your users would come from as well. So one thing to keep in mind with system security is any of the valid routes that users are going to use to get into the system, that's also a really great attack vector for an attacker to try to compromise the system. So in this case, we have the database server kind of separated. There's no route to it from where the attacker or the user would really be sitting. If you're going to the JIRA web application, you have no real need to actually access the database server. Unless maybe you're doing things like reporting off the database or something like that, if you have some custom crystal reports. But even in that case, I would still say you shouldn't be reporting directly against your database server. You should replicate to a read-only copy of the database and let people report off of that. That way, any malformed queries aren't going to take down your database server or affect the performance of JIRA because of bad reporting. And again, in a lot of these cases, really user error is going to be much more likely than some malicious attacker. But in both cases, you want to have protections set up to kind of mitigate any of the repercussions of what people are doing. Outgoing ports are not really all that commonly blocked, but your corporate policy may dictate that you shut down all outgoing ports, and that's great security if you do that, if you take it to that level. So if you're going to block outgoing ports from the JIRA server, just keep in mind the sort of things that JIRA tends to integrate with. So email, so SMTP, JIRA sends out a lot of email. And those email notifications are a really big part of the application. They really tie together some of the social components of it. They bring people back into the application by letting them know their tickets are being worked on. So at the very least, allowing SMTP connections is a really good thing. So that JIRA can talk to your SMTP server. If you're having incoming mail, then pop an IMAP. If you're going to connect to a database, as an enterprise customer, you're probably connecting to Active Directory or Open LDAP, whatever your user directory is. And there may be other services that are running on this system. Or JIRA may be connecting up to other Atlassian applications or Salesforce or some other third-party website that JIRA integrates with. So just consider those ports when you're blocking down your outgoing ports as well. And keep your backend systems isolated. And maintaining that isolation, I think, is one of the most important parts in your server and networking security setup. Any port that needs to be open needs to have a hardened daemon that's running on it. Anything that doesn't need to be exposed should be explicitly closed down. and really taking it a step beyond that. Anyone who doesn't explicitly need access, that should be explicitly denied, and then only allow the exceptions. So maybe put your database onto its own subnet, only allow a route between JIRA and the database server, and so that users themselves can't actually connect up to the database server. You probably have hardware firewalls as well. So use those hardware firewalls to control the flow of traffic through your different subnets and from the outside world in. But also consider running firewalls on your servers themselves. Something I took away from a university that I worked at was every server was a fortress. Everything was hardened, and that was true at the networking level as well as the server level itself. It does add a little bit of overhead from an administrative standpoint, because when you want to open up a new route, you might have a couple places you have to touch it, or you have to remember that you have IP tables running on your JIRA server. So just go ahead and get Confluence as well and document everything really well, so that you know where how all of your servers are set up and how all of your routes are set up. By building your network out in this way, and by isolating everything, what you're doing is making it more difficult for an attacker to continue to escalate their privileges. If somehow they did manage to compromise a user's account, maybe they sent out phishing emails, and maybe they got really lucky and got a system administrator password, so now they have a system administrator account in JIRA, and potentially they could leverage that to do something else and eventually get a shell account and move on and on. All the ways that attacks tend to progress. More than likely, again, what you're going to have is a user who inadvertently makes a mistake. So having all these levels of protection is going to mitigate the repercussions of that mistake and stop whatever is happening. But in the event that you have some spy movie level coordinated attack coming into your system, having all these layers of separation is going to slow them down. A highly trained, highly motivated group of attackers, you're not going to be able to stop them necessarily, but you're going to be able to slow them down. That's going to give your IDS, your intrusion detection system, enough time to notice that things are changing. Your monitoring system will probably pick up some anomalies as well. You'll get notified. That allows you to get people in place and start actively defending against that attack. Or if it was just a random attack or a user who made a mistake, then you'll still be notified that there's this problem. You can go in, fix whatever it was, figure out what went wrong, and figure out what you can do so that in the future you don't have that same problem again. So hardening everything down is not just a security concern against outside attackers, it's also going to make your system more robust. So then finally, from the system level, we were talking about encryption, SSL, as what you're primarily going to use for clients talking to JIRA, as well as JIRA talking to all the different systems that it talks to. I mentioned briefly that JIRA is a job application that runs in Tomcat. So if you want to serve directly out of Tomcat, that's fine. I think it's probably one of those arguable things that's out there, and different admins will have different opinions. That Tomcat is an application server and may not be the best thing to handle web traffic, whereas Apache is a web server and it will do a better job of sanitizing malformed requests and escaping encoded or re-encoding characters and things like that. So a very common way of setting up JIRA is to have Tomcat actually hosting JIRA using Apache as a proxy. Usually you run them on the same box, so if you're doing that, Apache and Tomcat can talk to each other in clear text. They're on the same server. It's not going over the wire anywhere. So in that case, you can terminate SSL in Apache or take it all the way back to Tomcat if that's what you want to do. And then, of course, you can serve directly out of Tomcat as well. There's a number of different ways that you can do it. Regardless of how you do it, once you get into JIRA, you're going to fall in love with it, and you're going to want the rest of the Atlassian suite, and you're going to get Confluence and Bamboo and Fisheye and Stash and so on. And then you're going to want to be able to tie them all together, because to get the most out of them, you need to create these application links between the different applications so they can share information. So that when you're checking code to your version control system, then Bamboo notices that, kicks off a build, ties all that information back to the ticket within JIRA that caused it to be kicked off in the first place. When you're running over SSL, if you're using a self-signed certificate, or depending on who what the trust chain is that you have set up, the different servers may not trust each other's certificates, and you'll get errors creating these application links. So you need to take the public key from the other servers and import that into your key store. So now you're starting to get into some kind of highly specialized systems administration skills using key tool and dealing with Java key stores and those sort of things. There's great references out there just on the internet. Atlassian has great documentation as to how to do it as well. But luckily for you with JIRA and Confluence, your life is made really easy. One of the Atlassian developers went out and just wrote a plugin that you just point it at a URL and give it a port number. It'll go out, do the SSL handshake, and get the public key and stuff it into a key store for you. So it'll make a copy of your key store with this new key added and give you instructions on how to then install that. And then you just restart JIRA, and now the two things trust each other, and you can create your application link. One thing that we see pretty consistently is that SSL is relatively complicated. Encryption in general, it's a lot of really high math and all kinds of crazy stuff, and it can be confusing how to set it up. Sometimes people will just kind of chip away at it until eventually it works, and then kind of back away slowly. But it is a good thing to do it right. It's what guarantees that systems are who they say they are. So JIRA knows that it's actually talking to Active Directory, that the communication between those two servers is being encrypted, that there's no man in the middle potentially sniffing that traffic. Same thing with JIRA and the client. So me as a user, I know that if I have a valid SSL certificate, that my communication back and forth to the JIRA server is not going to be able to be intercepted. That's especially important if you're out on the public internet, where who knows who could be potentially sitting in between you. You know, when you log in, you have usernames and passwords going over the wire. You probably have pretty sensitive corporate data that lives within your JIRA instance that you don't necessarily just want being out there. We're going to use all of these in-application security features to limit who has access to what. But if you're sending all of your data over the wire in clear text, you know, it's not trivial. It's still a relatively advanced attack to be able to go and get in the middle and get all that stuff. But if you can do that, then you have all that information for free. So SSL ensures that nobody's going to be able to snatch stuff out of the air and have it. They'll have to actually have better access. So again, for public-facing systems, you absolutely have to use SSL. At the very least, have your web server serving you're serving JIRA over SSL, so that users that are using the system, have encrypted traffic going back and forth. I think even if you're behind the firewall, if you're within your corporate environment on your inner networks, I still think it's a really good idea to serve JIRA over SSL. Again, we're going to use these in-application security features, so we want to make sure that there's no other way to actually get at that information either. And then for backend systems, you can encrypt the connection between JIRA and the database. You can encrypt between JIRA and your user directory, and then potentially with third-party add-ons as well. So having as many of those connections encrypted as possible. Again, the overhead for doing the encryption and decryption is pretty minimal, and it buys you a lot of security pretty much for free. It doesn't really interfere with the user experience in any way or make it more difficult for users. It just makes it more secure. Atlassian has hands down some of the best documentation of any product out there. As far as for security stuff and setting up Apache and securing Tomcat and all those things, these links will take you directly to those pages. But really anything that you want to know with setting up this suite or doing anything else is going to be documented in confluence.atlassian.com. And then when you get stuck, there's answers.atlassian.com, where you can get help from the whole community, from experts, from other users, bounce ideas off people. So a little bit of a side note, but there are great resources online for you to answer these questions when you're having trouble figuring out how to actually implement some of these things. So now that our server is nice and secure and everything is segregated to its own little area, all of our daemons are secured, let's look at what we can actually do within the application itself. First off, there are 3 different levels of administrators, and there's maybe a 4th kind of pseudo one that's in here where different add-ons will actually have administrative functions, and sometimes you can assign different users or groups to admin that particular add-on. But within the stock JIRA itself, you have your super user, the system administrator, and this user or group of users can do absolutely everything, including blow away all of your data. But it's more than that. It's really configuring everything and having the permission to do absolutely everything you can do within JIRA. There needs to be at least one group associated to this permission. It's a good idea to have as few people in the system administrator role as possible. You can get kind of a too many cooks in the kitchen kind of thing going on. So you have a second level of administrator, which is a JIRA administrator, which can do just about everything, but they can't import, export, SMTP configuration in general, anything that integrates to an external system, or actually touches files on the disk of the server itself. The JIRA administrator is not going to be able to do. But every other administrative function they're going to be able to do, creating workflows and screens and fields and all of that stuff. Out of the box, by default, JIRA has a group called JIRA administrators, and that group is granted the permission of JIRA administrator and system administrator. And that's fine for the vast majority of organizations. If you actually want to have lower level JIRA administrators and super user system administrators, you'll need to create a new group and adjust your global those global permissions so that those two permissions are broken out. But by default, they're tied together. And then lastly, you have this kind of lowest level administrator, which you actually grant through the permission scheme, and that's the project administrator. And as a project administrator, you can edit project roles, which coupled with permission schemes that we'll look at next, that will define who is allowed to actually use the project and who's allowed to do what within that JIRA project. Project administrators can also create components, versions, modify project details. It's a relatively restricted administrative privilege, but it's very useful, especially allowing people to provision users to their own projects. So how you actually do that through using roles is within your permission schemes, creating role-based permission schemes. The permission schemes are very, very granular. They're also reusable. So using roles is another way of being able to reuse your permission scheme. So if you have, you can create a software development project and you have your SDLC workflows and screens and the permissions that are around that. So users are allowed to do things maybe like create issues, but developers are allowed to edit issues and schedule them. Developers are assignable users. Maybe users are not allowed to close or resolve tickets. So whatever that setup that you want to have is, by using roles in the permission scheme, then you can reuse that exact same schema in other projects. And then in the project, you associate users and groups to roles. So that somewhat long chain determines who is going to have access to what. Again, just another little side note is that there are a lot of different ways to configure JIRA. So one of the things that you may want to do when you're figuring out how you're going to do it is standardize on a particular way of setting up your permissions. Use just roles or use just groups, but don't mix groups and roles. Things like that. By being repeatable, you're going to make it easier for people that have worked in other projects to know how to provision in this new project. And in that way, you're actually going to be enhancing your security as well, because people know what to do. They can anticipate how to do things correctly. So staying organized and staying consistent will improve that. Some of the other permissions, so I only put comments in the bottom right corner, but comments, work logs, and attachments all basically work the same way. Are you allowed to add them or not? With comments, can you edit your own? Can you edit all of them? And then with attachments, work logs, and comments, are you allowed to delete your own? Are you allowed to delete all of them? So you can see the permissions are very granular. You have very fine-grained control over who is allowed to do what in the project itself. Next up, we have a more specialized flow control, and those are workflow conditions. So within the workflow itself, our workflow is a big state diagram. We have open, in progress, resolved, closed. You move from state to state via transitions. So to move from open to in progress, you click on the start progress transition. By using conditions, you can further refine who is allowed to make those transitions. And in that case, you can prevent unauthorized users from advancing a ticket into parts of a workflow that they're not supposed to be able to move things. You can create choke points so that you can have a change advisory board that has to approve an idea before it can move to development, and so on. So there are a number of different ways that we can apply conditions. We have specialized roles like assignee and reporter. We also have the more generic project role itself. So again, by default, you have users, developers, and administrators. So we can say the user must be in the project role of developer in order to execute this transition. This screenshot of the start progress transition is actually a modified version of the default JIRA workflow. The default JIRA workflow has a condition that says the current user must be the assignee in order to start progress on a ticket, in order to execute this transition. How that presents itself in the UI is the start progress button is hidden from you unless you are the assignee of that ticket. Now you're probably thinking, well, I'm clever. I don't need a button on a website in order to do something. I'll just cleverly craft a URL, and that will be able to start progress by loading the correct page. But JIRA is smart enough to check, do you actually have permission when it does the transition as well? That becomes useful if you're using jelly scripts or other forms of automation that are automatically transitioning tickets for you, or using the API. JIRA is going to check all of those permissions and only allow you to do things that you're allowed to do. In general, JIRA is really good at only allowing you to do things that you are allowed to do and see things you're allowed to see. And that takes us to issue security. So within the project, you can limit which groups of people or which set of actors are allowed to use the project and what are they allowed to do in it. Issue security schemes give us issue level security. So within the project itself, we can now take a subset of issues and hide them so that only certain people can see them. In this setup, we're looking at a service desk where we have a number of different external clients that we have log into JIRA so that they can create support requests for us. And then we have our internal service desk users. So to create our security scheme, we define a number of different security levels. And then within each of those security levels, we define the users, groups, and roles that define that particular security level. So here we're using groups, and you can see in our client A level, we have our client A group, which has all of our client users from that particular client. It also has our service desk users. And down at the bottom, you see we have a private security level, which is the default. So this means if someone creates a ticket and they don't set a security level, or if they don't have permission to set the security level, it will automatically be set to a private internal ticket so that only our internal users can see it. And that way we don't risk exposing information to any of our clients. We especially don't want client A to know about anything that client B is doing, and so on. So this is pretty much the way that Atlassian's support is set up. So taking a look at what that actually does, when these two clients go in and enter tickets, they're going to be automatically added to their security levels. So here we have them running the exact same JQL query. So they're both running the exact same filter. They both get one issue back as a result. But you can see that they're different tickets. We have SRV 112 and 113. So the two users don't know about any of the other tickets. All of the permissions work that way in JIRA. So if you don't have access to a project, your queries are not going to return results from it. JIRA does a really, really good job of not leaking any information. So anything that you don't have permission to see, you're not going to see it in query results. If you just guess the ticket number, you're not going to be able to see it or glean any information from it. And any of the other ways that you can get reporting information as well in charts and graphs, none of that information is going to be included. So issue security schemes are another way of giving you a higher level of security within the application itself. So we went through and we talked about system level security itself, things you can do to harden the server, best practices around that, not only to make it more secure, but to make it more robust and reliable. We looked at what you can do within the application itself in terms of setting up permissions, creating different roles for users, workflow conditions, and issue level security. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope you took some value out of it. And if you have any questions, please let me know, and I'd love to answer those for you.
Please feel free to type your questions into the questions window.
So again, just to rehash them while we wait for some questions to come through, if after you go back to your desks and you think about it a little bit and you have a question, obviously you can feel free to contact me, and I believe my contact information was in the first slide, and we'll put that back up, or try to anyway. But if you have other questions, you can always go to answers.atlassian.com.
So looks like we had one question just pop in. For issue security on subtasks, is there a way for a client to see their subtask without having access to the parent issue?
It's a good question. I'm going to shoot from the hip a little bit because I'd have to verify this is actually true, but I would think that you should be able to do that. Subtasks are basically, they're just a special case of an issue itself. It would all revolve around whether or not you can set a security level on a subtask that's different than the parent. I'm not sure that you can do that, but as long as you could set the security level of the subtask individually, then you should be able to do that.
Great. We had another question just come in. Let me ask for some clarification on this. Some users can see CapCon on login and some don't. Why?
Is that the CAPTCHA, maybe?
Oh, yes, yes.
Okay, so that's actually, I'm glad you brought that up. I meant to mention that and I just forgot in my notes. But so in order to mitigate, brute force attacks, JIRA uses a CAPTCHA. So after some number of failed login attempts, it's going to throw up a CAPTCHA and say, before you can log in again, you need to give me a username, a password, and verify that you're actually a person, not some script who's just randomly trying to brute force attack this account. So users that see CAPTCHAs, once they successfully log in once, the CAPTCHA should not be present again the next time they log in. And as an administrator, you can go into their user account and actually reset their failed login numbers so that they don't see the CAPTCHA the next time they try to log in. I did get an answer for you on the subtask question. Subtasks do inherit their security level from the parent, so you're not going to be able to show subtasks and not show the parent task itself. So in order to do that, you'd have to use issue linking. So you had two issue level tickets, so that one could be hidden and linked to the one that is exposed to your client. There's another question that often comes up in this, and that's how do we actually enforce password, password policy? And the answer to that is delegated to your user directory. So Active Directory, OpenLDAP, those are typically the way that people do it. That allows you to enforce the complexity of the password, length and different types of characters, as well as the password history and how often it needs to be reset. In the enterprise environment, that's usually where you want it to be anyway, because you don't want to have so many usernames and passwords. So they're all coming out of your user directory as it is.
Okay. And another question come in from Carol. Is it possible to limit the visibility of particular issue fields, or at least limit their editability?
So that's a request that does come through a lot. Field level security itself is not something that is directly supported. There are a couple of different ways to do it. We've seen some unique solutions. Atlassian is working on a product which may or may not, which is intended to address that now. I'm not sure what level of publicity it has, so I guess I won't say too much about it. But in JIRA itself, you're not able to do field level security without doing something else. How we've addressed that in the past is within Confluence, we wrote a macro that lived within Confluence that only exposed certain fields from tickets to users. So they could still get at the comments and the attachments and some of the more generic details, but they couldn't see some of the other fields. So writing an add-on that gives you exactly what you need is an option that you have today, and I think there'll be some things coming out in the future which will get you closer to what you need.
Just on that note, mentioning some other possibilities you might want to explore on our marketplace at marketplace.atlassian.com. One of the vendors does provide a field security plugin for JIRA. Might be something you want to explore. Let's see. Okay, we've got a couple of other questions coming in um, from Christopher, from Warren, who's wondering if we can elaborate a little bit on why you shouldn't mix groups and roles in the permission schemes.
Sure. Now, there's actually nothing wrong with mixing groups and roles. Let me jump back to that slide. So when you actually configure a permission scheme, with each of these permissions, let's say create issue as an example, you have the option to do to use a specialized role like the assignee or the reporter. You can use actual roles like developer, user, administrator. You can use any of your groups. You can do individual named users, and there's a couple of other options as well. There's really nothing wrong with mixing groups and roles and putting individual users in there, especially if you're consistent and if you have a good use case or a reason for doing it. The reason that we standardize on roles is because it makes our permission schemes reusable. We can say that the role of user is allowed to create issues, whereas the role of developer is allowed to edit issues. Then in project A, B, and C, we can use the exact same permission scheme, but have different people in the role of users, in the role of developers. So that way, in each of the projects, different people are allowed to do different things, but we're only using the one permission scheme. Really, the reason to have some level of consistency, especially with permission schemes, why I think it's valuable, is that it can sometimes be a little bit cumbersome to figure out who actually has access to this project. And looking at it from a security perspective, if you're actually limiting access to projects because people are not supposed to know information that's stored within that project, then knowing who actually has access to that project is a really big deal. When you initially set up the project, of course you know exactly who has access to it. But as time goes on, other admins come in, maybe modify the permission scheme, add other users to the roles. It becomes a little more clouded as to who actually, what is the set of users that's allowed to do things in this project and what are they allowed to do. There's a couple of helper functions within JIRA itself to help you figure that stuff out. But by having a consistent scheme that you use, it's a little bit easier to backtrack and figure out who's actually allowed to do what in this project. So again, there's nothing wrong with mixing roles and groups, but not doing that can potentially keep things a little clearer for you.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris.
Yep.
One other question just came in. What's a good way? This is around issue security levels, but Tim is wondering what's a good way for setting up issue levels based on our user group automatically? So I guess the question is without having to select an actual issue level every time you're creating one.
Right. So in this particular case, whenever someone from client A comes in and creates a ticket, they're going to automatically, that ticket's going to automatically be set to the client A security level because that's the only security level that they have permission to access. In the case of our SRV users, our service desk users, if they're putting in a ticket for a client, like if someone calls them and says, hey, I've had this problem, and they're putting in a ticket, they're going to have to explicitly pick the security level. Which you did I think, a pretty interesting implementation of this with a client where, again, they're using Confluence as their portal for their clients to use. So that's where they come in, they get a bunch of stuff, but that's also where they can put in tickets and look at their existing tickets. And in doing that, we use the issue collector, which allows you to embed this little widget into any website to create tickets in any JIRA installation. That's that got feedback link you see around. So we use the issue collector, and in the JavaScript, we included in a little bit of extra code to set the security level automatically for whoever is adding this ticket. So that way, even if it's one of the SRV users, one of our service desk users that's adding the ticket, just the fact that they created a ticket from a specific page set the security level automatically for them.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Chris. Looks
Yeah.
like I don't see any other additional questions, but I'll give folks a little bit of time if someone's still typing. But if not,
Well, great. These were great questions. I'm really glad you brought those up. Some of those were points that I wanted to make anyway, and just forgot in the excitement of running through all these slides. But again, I really thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Feel free to ask any more questions.
okay. I think with that we'll wrap up. Just want to say thank you again to everyone for joining, and also thank you, Chris from Praecipio, for presenting today on JIRA security. It's a great overview. And We will be sending out a notice soon about our next upcoming technical workshop. And thanks again, everyone, for joining today.